screen. Okay, so today, guys, I want to show you some of the most popular openings, but the idea is not to learn the whole openings, but in general to see what are the plans in different openings, and this might help you to choose a right opening for you when you know, for example, 5, 6 different openings, and you can see now what usually both players wants to do, white and black. And maybe you can like some of the openings and you might want to learn them and to try. So I will show you the main openings. Let's start with e4, because I believe that most people maybe play e4. Okay, so for example, when we play with white and you play e4 and black is playing e5. Now, I know that most, especially juniors, they just play this Italian knight f3, bishop c4, knight c3, which is possible, of course, but it's not the only opening which you can play. But I suppose that maybe because they don't know the other openings, they don't know what are the ideas and why do you make the other moves, so they just play the most simple kind of setup, which normally I have seen many games with this bishop c4, bishop c5, knight c3, knight f6, and so on. And now I will show you, for examples. You see that there are many different ideas only against c5. There are probably 5 or 6 openings which are possible for white. So they're quite different. There are some gambits, and there are some more positional systems, and there are also systems which are more direct. I suppose that you know what is gambit. Gambit we call usually this opening when you sacrifice a pawn or 2 pawns, or it could be even sometimes you sacrifice a piece in order to get a quick development and to try to prepare early attack. So against e5 there are 3 gambits. The king's gambit, of course, this is the most maybe famous, probably most of you know, that this was the most popular opening in the 19th century. Most of the games were in the king's gambit. What is the reason for this? Because at that time, people were playing mainly for fun, and they wanted to win the game, but not only to win the game, they wanted to win beautiful game with a lot of sacrifices, combinations. For them, the win is not so important. They wanted just to play beautiful chess and to make a lot of combinations. And in the king's gambit, of course, there are plenty of sharp lines where white is sacrificing and black can make a counter sacrifice, and the game's really very exciting. But nowadays, the theory thinks that king's gambit is not so good for white. Even if black knows some very good lines, he can get some advantage. But if black doesn't know, also he can lose very quickly. For instance, now I can show you very quickly what are the main ideas of the king's gambit. So why does white is exposing his king? Because now the king is exposing on this diagonal. And why this? He's sacrificing the pawn because black can take. The idea in general for white is to build a nice center with d4, and later, for example, if black plays some random move, if white manages to take the pawn back, actually it will be very good if you can get something like this with white, with 2 pawns in the center, with 2 knights, with the bishop on f4, the other bishop is coming. Definitely white will have advantage. But it's not that simple, because first of all, now if white plays immediately d4, there is annoying queen h4 check, and now white has to move the king, which is not so great because the king has to go forward, and then he's disrupting the development of the bishop, of the knight, and also he's in a dangerous position. That's why in this situation, white has 2 possibilities. He can play bishop c4. This move makes sense. And there are very famous games when in the past white won with this line. The idea of this move is, of course, to develop the bishop, but also if black now delivers this check, the king is moving not to e2, but already he has the square f1. And although you can say, yes, now white is also losing the castle, he is a pawn down, but his next move probably will be knight f3. Let's say black plays something like this, knight f3. So he is developing the knight and he's attacking the queen. So the queen has to move somewhere, let's say, I don't know, let's say here. Then he plays d4, creating a nice center. And again, he wants to take the pawn. Then he can play knight c3, knight d5. So actually, it is very, very complicated. Yes, there are some bad things that it's a pawn down, the king is in the middle, but also there are some good things. And the question is, which will prevail? Even more popular is to start with the knight to f3, because now it's developing the knight, it's protecting the check, and then to try to move the bishop, and then castle, d4. So this is quite exciting. Now, from black's point of view, what he has to do in the king's gambit, if he wants to take the pawn, then usually he has to try to defend it. And he can do it by playing this move, g5. Even now, this is one of the most popular moves, but this is a move which you normally do not want to make in any other opening. So most of the people who doesn't know this move, they will never play it because g5 is obviously exposing the king. And then you think, okay, if I play g5, where I'm going to castle after this. So this is very risky, as black is defending the pawn, but the position now becomes very, very unclear. Here there are different lines. For instance, there are lines where white plays h4, and now black has to play g4, and then white can play knight e5 or knight g5. Even I have seen lines where white is sacrificing the knight on f7, then bishop c4, check castle, he's trying to attack on the f file. So they are quite wild positions in this king's gambit. And if black doesn't take, he has, of course, other possibilities. And also there is one thing which you have to know if you ever play this opening with white or with black, that actually in the moment after the move f4, white is not threatening to take the pawn. For instance, if black play the bishop. Now, do you think that it is good for white to take this pawn? And what will happen? Can you maybe, again, we can use these messages. Can you try to see what will happen if white takes the pawn? Why this is a mistake? You can put your answers in the chat box. So if white take the pawn, what is wrong with this move? To attack d4, but how exactly? Okay, if he takes, then what? To play bishop to d4, or what? How exactly to attack the d4? Okay, let's move this so you have more clear view on the board. What can now happen for black? Yes, here I see two possibilities for black, because if black plays some normal move, white will just play maybe knight f3 or d4. He will defend the pawn, and then simply black have lost the pawn for nothing. So he has to think about this check with the queen. And now there are two possibilities. Either you take first the knight, because white has to take with the rook, and then he's losing the castle, and then you give check by attacking this h pawn and the e pawn, or you can immediately give this check, and you have to think about maybe which of those two is better. First to take the knight and check, or first check. What do you think? Which move order is better? Okay, let's switch it from black's point of view. And what is the difference between those two moves? If we take, for example, the knight, and if white takes, and now we give check, he has to play g3. Now we can take h2, we can take e4, but after this he will just move the queen to e2, and then it's more or less okay for white, nothing special. So better is to give immediately the check, because now the problem for white is that after g3, when black takes, he also attacks the rook. And here very important is, by the way, that the white pawn is here. If the pawn was not here, you see that the king is on the file, and it will be impossible for black to take the rook. But if this pawn is here, then he can safely take the rook. And if white moves the king, what will happen in this case? What is the best move now for black? Yes, queen f2 is good, but then the king will escape, at least for a while, and queen e4 is immediately a checkmate. So only for 4 moves, actually, black can checkmate the white king if he's not careful. That's why after bishop c5, which is one of the possible lines, so white has to play knight f3 first, and only then he can think about taking the pawn, because the knight is defending the h4. And also there is one very popular system for black, maybe some of you have seen. This is the move d5, which is actually a counter gambit, because now white has to take the d pawn, and although black can take on d5, on f4, which is actually quite okay, the main line is neither of those moves, but it is the move e4. And the idea of this move is that to prevent the move like knight f3, and to make a little bit more difficult the development of the white. And now there are a lot of theory. This line was actually has become very famous when in the past Paul Morphy have defeated his opponent in one very nice game, and since then many people try to play with black this aggressive line. So you can see that in the King's Gambit the positions are pretty wild, and you have to be prepared for everything. It's quite complicated opening, but still it's very exciting. So if you prefer to play a sharp positions where there's a lot of combinations, but also it's a bit dangerous, this could be your opening. But if you don't like, maybe it's better not to play. So later, when people started to realize that this is dangerous for white, there was a new trend in the time when, in order to prepare the move f4, white was playing knight c3, and after any random move which black can make, for example here, then he was playing f4. This is called the Vienna game, when you start with knight c3, and this is also a possible line. Again, of course, black he can take, he can also move the bishop to c5. There are various lines, and this is a little bit maybe more safe comparing to the king's gambit, because when the moves knight c3 and knight c6 are inserted, then now the d5 move is not so fast like usually black can play d5. And here, of course, white can play knight f3, which could transpose to some of the lines in the king's gambit. And also there was one line which was the favorite line of the first world champion Wilhelm Steinitz. He used to play here d4, and he was allowing this check, and he moved king e2 because he thought that when the knight is moved on c3, he can jump on d5 at some point and to attack on c7, and also now knight f3 is coming with the tempo. So here there were many games in which white was winning, black was winning. It's quite sharp position, of course. And if you don't want to play at all f4 in the Vienna game, here there is another setup which actually I have started to play in the last few years with white. I play nowadays the line of g3, which is quite different from any other opening like the Italian, Ruy Lopez, because normally the bishop is always on this diagonal, e2, c4, b5, but also it could be on g2. It looks a bit maybe not so active, but there is some idea, because the plan for white is to move the bishop. Normally they play bishop to c5, and now the knight goes to e2. Knight f3 is not so good because it's closing the bishop. I prefer knight e2. And then what is the plan in this position when white plays this opening? Okay, now sometimes black now, in order to keep the bishop, plays the move a6. Why he's playing this move? Because white can try to move the knight to a4, and since the bishop is closed from the pawn and he cannot go back, if he goes to b4, white can simply attack it with the pawns, a3, b4, and then white can exchange this bishop. So it makes sense from black's point of view to play a6, because now if white moves the knight, then the bishop can go back to a7, where he's almost equally good, but the knight on a4 will be actually very bad. And at some point he has to go back to c3. And now usually I play h3, and the idea for white is to prepare the move f4 and f5. For example, if they move the bishop to e6, you have to move the king away from the pin, and then already f4 is coming. Let's say queen d7, f4, and here the plan for white is to push the pawns f5, followed by g4, maybe knight g3, g5, f6, or g6. Also, if you have a chance, knight d5 at some moment. And I managed to win actually a couple of games quite easy in this system with white, only because I know the plan in this Vienna. So another gambit against e5 is the so-called Northern Gambit, or it could be Danish Gambit. It has different names. When instead of f4, white plays d4. This is also a possible opening. Now, if black takes, white can take with the queen. This is called the central opening. It's a little bit like Scandinavian defense, which black is playing, e4, d5. Now, of course, black can move the knight with the tempo. That's why it has a bad reputation for white, because you're moving the queen from the start, but then he starts to attack with the knight, so he's gaining some time. And here the queen goes to e3. Of course, not to c3, because on c3, immediately white is losing the game with this move bishop to b4. And then you lose the queen. So she goes to e3, but this is a little bit strange opening for white. So the northern gambit is when white sacrifices another pawn with c3. Now he wants to take on d4 with the pawn, so black normally takes. And now white moves the bishop to c4, and black can take another pawn. And this is very exciting opening in which white is 2 pawns down, but he has a very good development and the bishops are very active. He wants now to play knight f3, castle, queen b3, maybe to attack on f7. So yes, this is very risky for white, because if the attack is not working, you can just end up with 2 pawns down. But if the attack is successful, you can maybe win the game very easy. So nowadays, also it doesn't have some great reputation, but I will just show you the main line because it's very exciting. And although black has many possibilities to defend the pawn, most people prefer to give the pawns back immediately, but to stop the attack. How can black achieve this? Here, the most popular move, which might look strange to you, is the move d5. Why does black is sacrificing his central pawn? The idea is that now, if white takes with the pawn, then already black can try to develop more easy, because he can move the knight to f6, then he can move the bishop somewhere on the diagonal and to castle. So he will be with a safe king and with extra pawn. So white usually takes with the bishop. And now black goes knight f6, trying to exchange this strong bishop. And here there is one very common type of combination, which is good to learn. Maybe some of you might know. But what do you think that white should play here? Let's see who knows. Okay, Kirtan knows. Okay, let's see if Ethan can find. Yeah, okay. So bishop f7, yeah, very good. Bishop f7, because the king has to defend both the queen and the bishop, and it's not possible. And now, by the way, it looks like white is winning, but he's not totally winning, because after king takes, queen takes, now, do you see how black can take the queen back? What can now black do in exchange? Yes, exactly. Bishop b4 check, attacking the queen. So now, in order not to lose the queen for nothing, white has to move the queen back. And then after all those fireworks and sacrifices, in the end, there is some kind of endgame where everything is equal, the pawns and the pieces, and the position is more or less equal. So this is a very easy way for black to just give the 2 pawns back, the d pawn and the f pawn, but to exchange the most dangerous pieces. Of course, if he wants to try to keep the material and to develop, he can also try, but he has to be careful. For example, knight f6, it will be e5, and then the knight doesn't have too many squares because it could be queen d5 coming if you go to e4. So it's not that easy to develop for black. So this is interesting to play such a gambits, especially in blitz rapid games, because for black it will be more complicated to find how to defend, so he can waste his time or he can make some mistake. So now let's move with the other openings. Knight f3, of course, is the most common move nowadays. And now black has three possibilities: knight f6, knight c6, and the pawn to d6. Knight f6, you know, this is called the Petrov defense, but it's not after me. Sometimes they ask me, did I have invented this opening? But unfortunately, no, it was invented a long time ago. What is the idea of knight f6? The idea is to stop or to slow down the move with the bishop, because now both pawns are under attack. So white should either protect his pawn, either he has to take the e5 pawn. And if he defends, it's not good to do it with the pawn, because if you play d3, you block the bishop. So at least you have to play knight c3. And this actually is another opening called the four knights opening, where it could be again Italian, or it could be with bishop b5. It is considered to be, in general, equal position. Knight e5 is the most popular move. And here there is one trap, which probably you should know, that if black takes the pawn, do you know? Okay, let's try to see now. Do you know what white has to do after this move? Yes, here the best move is queen e2, but not queen f3, because queen f3, he can simply go back knight f6. Queen e2, and of course, if black moves the knight somewhere, then you play knight c6, and he cannot defend the queen. Here also you take the queen. The best option for black is to play d5, and then d3. And now queen e7 is the most stubborn move, because now if white moves the knight, black also moves the knight. And here the best for white is to take this knight and then to take this pawn. And in the end, white is winning one pawn, which is good. It's not winning the knight, but still one pawn is okay if black still finds the best defense. And black usually plays d6, and then the knight goes back, because now queen e2 is not doing anything, simply queen e7, and then, yeah, the game is completely equal. So in this case, white plays normally d4, and then he tries to attack the knight with the bishop. So one of the main lines is d5, bishop to d3, and now there are various lines for black with knight c6, bishop e7, bishop d6, bishop f5, bishop g4. In general, white wants to castle, and then rook e1 to put some pressure on the knight. And if the knight stays there for a long time, even c4 is possible in the future, knight c3. And the game is also close to equal. Maybe white has a very small advantage, but not so much. Then also there is this, which I showed you last time, the fifth door and those traps. I remember that we have seen this d6. And knight c6 is leading to this Italian game. It could be leading to Italian game if white plays bishop c4, or it could be to Ruy Lopez or to Scotch. Italian game is with bishop c4, where now it depends what black will do. Knight f6 allows this right lever attack, which I think we have discussed last time, if I remember correctly. And bishop c5 is more common. And now, yes, like I told you, most people play knight c3, knight f6. But I think this is just a completely equal position. For example, d3, h6 to stop the pin. White also can stop the pin. And then this position is totally symmetrical. Completely, everything is the same. It's difficult to find how to advance and to create something dangerous in the next maybe 5-6 moves. So in order to achieve something more maybe promising for white, he prefers to play the pawn to c3, not the knight, because this could create threats like b4 or d4, which will create this nice center. So I think c3 in general is more promising than knight c3, because black now has to know what to do. For example, if he plays something like d6, white will create a very nice center this way, and already white has advantage because he has two pawns in the center. So black has to know some very long theoretical lines, which usually the good players know, by the way. Knight f6 is the best move. And now white has to choose between d3. This is a very popular system called Gioco Piano. Nowadays, everybody plays this. Carlsen, Caruana, Anand, all the top players have played. I have also played this many times with white. And in this case, the game is more kind of quiet, solid. Nothing major is going on in the first 15-20 moves because there is a lot of maneuvering. White usually is moving the bishop back to b3 in order not to be exchanged. And then the plan in those positions is, okay, black can push the pawns. And this is very important idea if you ever have such a position for white. The knight has to go to d2. Let's say black plays something like this. Then you move the rook to e1. Okay, let's say he plays here, and then you play the knight to f1, and then the knight goes to g3. So this is knight d2, you move the rook, knight f1, knight g3. What is the idea of this maneuver? Because when the pawns are like this, the knight is not so good on b1, and c3 is not possible. a3, it's not so good, a3, and then c2. But when you go to d2, when the knight was here, he was stopping the move d4. So he has to go to f1 g3 to protect the e4 pawn, because eventually we want to play d4. Okay, what is d4? But after he takes on b3, takes on d4, it could be here that black has two hits. And now when already white has defended the pawn, he can think about the move d4. That's why this is a very standard idea. The bishop from c1. The bishop from c1 usually stays here for a long time. And when you want to move the bishop, usually he goes to e3. And you can exchange both bishops in those situations if you want. e3 is the more or less the only reasonable square for the bishop. And in this line, the game is in general equal. As you can see, nothing exciting is going on. Simply they are developing the pieces quietly. If white wants to play a little bit more aggressive, he has to play the move d4. And now, again, depends what black will do. He has to take, of course, and now there are various actually lines. Take on d4, pushing the pawn with d5, also castle. And black has to be prepared in those lines, because if he doesn't know, he can be in trouble. For instance, after e5, I don't remember if last time we have seen this opening, but do you know what is the best move now for black? Okay, Kirtan knows. Let's see if it knows. Okay, so there are two suggestions, d5 and queen e7. d5 is the main move because queen e7 is not so good for two reasons. First of all, maybe white can simply take the pawn on d4. I suppose that, yeah, this is just a good move. But also there is another thing, that even if white castles, actually you cannot take the pawn, because if you take it, then white will take, and in the end you lose your queen. Or okay, you can maybe put the knight, but after he attacks the knight with something, probably you lose the knight. So the best move is indeed the move d5, and this is a very standard move for such situations when white is sacrificing the pawn and is pushing e5. There are other similar lines, even without c3, when white directly plays d4 and e5. And it's always d5, because most of the time, the lines where he takes and takes and takes on g7 and rook g8, maybe initially they might look a little bit dangerous for you, for black. But actually, black is quite fine, because the white pieces, actually, you see that they're not developed. And yes, the pawn on g7, but this pawn probably is going to be lost, because even if you try to defend, I think here they choose between bishop g5, bishop h6. There are some theoretical lines, but black always takes this pawn, either with the queen on f6, either with the rook. Then in case of some checks, he just puts the bishop on e6. So he's protecting those pawns. And when white takes on the d4, black takes with the knight, trading the knight, bringing the bishop to d4, and he is quite fine, moving the queen, and then he can just castle queen side. So this is not so dangerous for black. And usually white actually prefers to keep his bishop, and he goes to b5, because now already black has to move the knight. But when black insert the move d5, the knight on e4 has a very good outpost. What is the difference if you do it without d5? If you play immediately here, now white can play the bishop to d5, and suddenly this knight now doesn't have any protection. That's why d5 is the best move for black. And here, and now knight e4, and white takes. And this is a very popular system. There are thousands of games. In half of them, black is giving this check. In half of them, he is going back to b6. I think both moves are, in general, good, because here the check is okay because you gain a tempo. But on b6 also is good because there is a pressure on d4. And after black castles, he can think about maybe bishop g4 and to try to attack the pawn. So again, the game is very complicated. It's overall is close to equal position, but black has to know this idea. And the other line is if take, bishop b4 check. This is also a very popular system where white is choosing now between bishop d2 or knight c3. Bishop b2 is more solid move because the idea is that if black takes, now white is defending the pawn with the knight. So it seems that he has a nice center and good development, and he should be better. But now black can destroy this nice center with the move d5. And then white has to take, knight takes. And although white has some initiative in the beginning, because he has a little bit better development, now he plays queen b3. But slowly, if black knows what to do, he should be able to defend. Now he's choosing between knight a5 and knight e7. Both are actually quite good moves. Knight e7 is maybe more popular. And after castle, castle, although white has slightly better development, but he has this isolated pawn. And okay, now you can just improve the rooks. And now black has to take control of this square d5. So very important move is c6 to cement the position of the knight. And after this, usually white can jump with his knight something. Black is trying to exchange the queens. Then he's moving the bishop somewhere, bringing the rooks. And slowly he should equalize the game. So again, if black knows what to do, the game is around equal. If white wants to play more aggressive, he has to take some risks and to sacrifice with knight c3. I don't remember. I think we have seen also this line, right? Last time. I think I have showed you. Knight e4 and then castle. And here there is a plenty of theory. If black knows the best moves, he's fine. But if doesn't know, he might lose very quickly. So those lines are quite dangerous for black if you don't know them. So now also there is an opening called the Scotch defense, where white immediately goes d4. And after pawn takes, he takes with a knight. The idea of this opening is obviously to open the diagonals for the bishops and to develop very quickly and to castle. Now, one very common mistake which black is doing is to take the knight. Why this is a mistake? Because after the queen takes, now actually this queen is quite strong because she's attacking on g7, on a7, on d7. So you cannot move the bishop, you cannot move the rook, and there is no knight c6. This is the difference from this central opening, that now there is no knight c6, so the queen is safe for the next few moves. So what black has to do, he should move the knight or the bishop. There is one line where black moves the bishop to c5. And now also white has a choice. He can defend with bishop e3. He can take the knight. He can go to f5, to b3. There are various lines. Bishop e3 is, I think, the most popular, which has immediately the threat knight takes d6. For example, if black plays some stupid move, white now is winning the bishop for free. Also, now if black wants to defend the bishop, this is also a mistake, because now when white takes, you see what will happen. Black now has a triple pawns, which is very, very bad for the end game, to having a triple pawns and also without any protection from the side. is very bad. So after bishop e3, black usually moves the queen to f6 to put more pressure on the knight. And now if white takes, this already is a mistake because black will take the bishop. And now white has those very weak double pawns in the center. So after queen f6, white has to play c3, and then, yeah, there is a lot of theory. It's a very complicated position. One small trick, which black also has here, is that if white takes on c6, of course, black can take with any of the pawn, but also he can play the move queen to f6, threatening a checkmate. And still, of course, attacking the knight, because if the knight goes here, black just takes it. And now white has to defend with his queen. He goes either queen d2, either queen f3, and now it could be some kind of endgame if black now takes the on f3. Yeah, this is some kind of equal endgame, more or less. Another line very popular for black is knight f6. And now white has to choose between knight takes d6 or to defend the pawn, but not with the bishop, because with the bishop you lose the knight. So it has to be with this knight. And now the bishop goes not to c5, but to b4 in this case, to pin this knight and to put pressure on the pawn on e4. And now, by the way, if you don't know what to do with white, it could be a problem, because I have seen people to give piece to play bishop d3 to forget about the knight. f3 is also not so good. Bishop g5 is also not so good, because after h6, if you move the bishop back, it's g5 and then knight takes. If you take, then queen takes is attacking both knights. So this is a mistake. The best move is to take the knight. Now normally black takes with the b pawn. And now white has to defend with the bishop to d3, and then black usually goes d5 to attack the pawn. And white should take, and black normally takes, and this is a very popular system. You can also find thousands of games. Bishop to g5 now has this idea to take on f6 and to take on d5. So black usually goes c6 to protect the pawn, and then queen f3, and then there are plenty of possibilities. Bishop e7, bishop d6, there are various systems, but it is a very popular system as well in the Scotch. And finally, okay, not finally, we have also two openings which we have to cover. I told you in Italian about this idea with c3 and d4, which if black knows, he will equalize. So in order to gain a tempo towards this idea, white is happy to sacrifice this pawn. This is the gambit called Evans gambit. And I think probably from all the gambits, this is the best, because here at least white is not worse. Even if black knows the best moves, still the game is around equal. Now, the idea of this is that you are dragging the bishop to b4 by sacrificing the pawn in order to gain this tempo to play c3 and then instantly d4. And here it's very complicated. There are plenty of possibilities. Bishop a5 and bishop e7 are considered to be the best moves for black. For example, bishop a5, and now white can play d4. And here also black must know what to do. There are some lines like he takes on d4, white is castling. And then the idea is queen b3, knight g5. So white has a good compensation. But again, if black managed to develop and to keep the pawn, he can have a good game. So you must know when you play the gambits, because there is some risk. You must know how to punish your opponent if he makes a mistake, and also what to do in case he plays the best moves, because otherwise, if you don't know, you can just lose the pawn for nothing. And finally, against e5, we have to see the Ruy Lopez. It is probably the most popular opening, Spanish game. In the beginning, they have started to play this maybe in the 19th century, thinking that the threat is to take the knight and then to take the pawn, which looks very logical. But actually, okay, and also in the beginning, black always was playing d6 because they thought that, yeah, he has to defend the pawn. Later, they have found out that actually this is not some big threat, and they have started even to attack the bishop. Because it turns out that if white takes, black should take with the d pawn. And now if white takes, black has even two good solutions. Queen to g5, attacking the knight and attacking the g2 pawn. So probably white has to play d4, queen g2, and then queen f3 to try to defend the rook, and the game is around equal. Or even black can play queen d4. And now white is losing the pawn with check, so he is losing the castle as well. So although there are some grandmasters, even in the past, Bobby Fischer, you know, probably the most famous chess player ever, he used to play this line with white. He was taking the knight, but not e5. He was playing now knight c3 or castle, and his idea was actually to play those kind of pawn structure when black has double pawns. Now usually black is defending with f6. f6 in general is a bad move when white has the bishop, because he can play bishop c4. But if white doesn't have light square bishop and black can bring his on e6, actually this is quite okay. And now white is playing the move d4. And what is the idea now about this position? This endgame was very popular. Now Fischer was playing knight b3. They play nowadays knight e2. And this endgame is of course around equal. But why white was willing to play this endgame? Because he thinks that if he keeps exchanging pieces and it leaves only the pawns in the end, let's imagine that we can trade all the pieces. The pawn endgame, black has 2 c pawns against 1. Basically, with 1 pawn, you can block 2. And then the e pawn could remain like an extra pawn. Although it's very difficult to exchange all the pieces, because black probably will not be willing to exchange them, but still there are people who try, and it is around equal, but it's possible to play this. But most people prefer to go back to a4, not to take, and to bring the bishop back to b3 at some point when later black attacks. So you might say, but what is the reason? Why do you move the bishop? So he can attack with the pawns. Aren't you helping black to gain some space? If you think this looks a little bit like the Italian game, because in Italian the bishop is also on this diagonal, the only difference is that black is playing k6 and b5. But this is not so great for black to play b5, because in the future, after white castles, he can try to play the move like a4 in many occasions, and then with queen e2, with knight c3 to try to attack this pawn. So black has to be careful later about the b pawn. Now the main line is knight f6 to attack the pawn. White usually castles. And there are plenty of lines. Now black can take the pawn. He can play b5. He can play bishop e7. He can play d6. The most popular is bishop e7. And now if white takes the pawn, the thing is that when the bishop is on e7, black can take on e4 because rook e1 or queen e2 is not dangerous. Black can simply move the knight back and the bishop is covering the checks. So white usually first is defending the pawn. Now already he wants to take on c6 and he wants to take the pawn. So black has to attack the bishop, and then black usually plays d6, and white normally plays, no, again, not knight c3, but like in the Italian, c3. So you see that this c3 is very common idea in order to prepare d4, and now after castle. Here white, okay, he can play d4, but most people play h3 to avoid this pin. And then white wants to play d4. And here there are plenty of lines. Here you can find tens of thousands of games. Knight a5 is the main move, but also bishop b7. Even there is a strange line, knight b8, knight d7. There is rook e8. Knight a5 is the main move. It's very important for white to keep the bishop, not to allow black to take it. So he goes back to c2, and then it's c5, and then it's d4, and then usually black is not taking. He wants white to take something. And this is one of the most complicated openings. A lot of maneuvering, a lot of different lines, and that's why it's very popular. So I think today we have covered most of the openings, I think almost all, in this e4, e5. So you see how many options you have for white, not only to play the same moves like Italian, knight c3. So there are plenty of options for white, which are quite different from the gambits, from the Scotch, Spanish, Italian, Vienna game. So if you like some of those openings for white or for black, you can also try in some blitz games or rapid games, and then you can decide which opening is good for you. Okay, guys, our time has finished for today. I hope that you have learned something interesting. So have a nice day and see you again next week. Okay, bye.